I'm Elaine Viets. On today's Dead End Job show, I'm talking with Kenneth Treister, author of Maya Architecture, Temples in the Sky. Kenneth, this is a gorgeous book. It's really a shame our listening audience can't see the beautiful color photos and illustrations. So let's start with the basics. When did the Maya, when were they in power, and what part of the Americas did they rule?
Well, the Maya started before the birth of Christ, before the new era, but actually became great builders after. And in the first and up to the second century, flourished. And so they were the great builders in what's called Mesoamerica. That is the southern part of Mexico and the northern part of Central America. So it'd go from Honduras to Guatemala, where they were great, Belize, and southern Mexico, the Yucatan and Chiapas and all the southern provinces of Mexico. So the Maya were one of many civilizations that flourished during what's called the pre-Columbian era in Mesoamerica. I mentioned those different civilizations in passing in the book, but it's primarily about the Maya because the Maya sort of excelled. Many of the civilizations were great builders, had common characteristics, but the Maya were exquisite. They were the most beautiful civilization, as exemplified by their architecture and art.
Now, they're famous for their pyramids, and those of us who visited the Maya pyramids in Central America and Mexico, we're not really seeing the whole picture. What did those pyramids and temples look like in their heyday?
Well, in the book I say what we see now, what we imagine, and what really was. What we see now is archaeological ruins, which are beautiful, with jungle creeping through the stone. Then our imagination can envision these glorious cities with landscaping and pageantry and music and excitement. And then there's a reality that we never will know is what they actually were like. But basically, it was an integration of art and architecture and society. Today, architecture and art are commodities. They're separate. You buy, you sell, you trade, you auction, or you do whatever you want with art. You hang it. But in those days, the Maya civilization was a totality. And art and architecture was one. And literature was one. And the social fabric was one. So it's hard to imagine a city and pyramids like they had. But we do have in the book some National Geographic paintings by other artists that show conceptually what these great cities look like.
I was surprised by the paintings, how colorful they were.
Yes, today we see just the ruins without the paint. But the architecture was vividly painted. Their bas-relief, their sculpture, everything was very vivid, their costumes. And these paintings show the bright colors, and the plazas and the ground was mostly covered in lime. So it was a totality of a painting. And everything was painted, everything was beautiful, and everything was, at least in our mind, based on what we see archaeologically, it was a total work of art.
Well, they also, from what you mentioned in the book, they were not just builders, they were master showmen. And at Chichen Itza, I believe there was a feathered snake that, because of the design of the architecture, it would appear twice a year.
Yeah, that's one of the great phenomena. Most of the Maya architecture was, as you said, showmanship by the priests, the architects, the rulers. And to sort of wow the population, but to also show their superiority. They use their astronomical skills in laying out the buildings. And they could, by observation, plot the planets and plot the sun and plot the moon. And so the buildings were oriented to reflect that eventual movement of the heavenly bodies. So in Chichen Itza, the great pyramid of the inscriptions is designed so that during the equinox and the solstice, and it projects when the sun sets through the edge of the pyramid a snake ascending and descending on the balustrade of the steps. And the balustrade ends in giant carved serpent's heads. So when you get there, you can, on the right time, and it's a few days before and after, you can see at sunset the snake crawling down the pyramid. Now imagine the awe of the population when the high priest would predict the day that would happen. And it happened. So here they become very important. But this phenomenon, now we didn't discover it, we being Western civilization, till relatively modern times. And now it's quite a festival. And people can go to Mexico, to the Yucatan, to Chichen Itza, and see this phenomenon. And it's quite extraordinary. But that happens in almost all their buildings, some astronomical phenomenon and orientation.
Well, the Maya could teach us many lessons about urban planning. I live in Fort Lauderdale, and there are constant fights about what we call the condo canyons down here, in which just tall, featureless buildings are built to block out the view. The Mayans would not permit that.
Well, you're hitting a very important thing. The book is about Maya architecture. But the book is a critique on the failure, the disaster of modern architecture and modern city planning. This relatively primitive, not primitive, but this ancient civilization, the Maya, in a very hostile environment, and without the riches that we have, and without the libraries and universities and the history, built magnificent cities and magnificent buildings that compared to our efforts are fabulous. And our efforts are terrible. Our cities are clogged with automobiles, with expressways, with chaos. Our buildings are basically ugly. There's no continuity. There's no homogeneity. There are in some campuses at universities. There are in a few cities of the world. But generally, we are failures at city planning and architecture and art, and we should look to the Maya to see how they almost perform miracles in creating beauty. The one underlying word for the Maya architecture and art is beauty, and the one thing that we need in our lives is beauty, is sanctity, is a place to have your eye rest on something beautiful. And they did it, and we don't. And we should take advantage of this museum of art and architecture that's right off south of America, south of our coast, and try to learn these lessons.
What was a Mayan city like during its golden age? They were garden cities, is that correct?
Yes, garden cities. First of all, there was long roads straight through the jungle between cities. And then you would come to an entrance gate. And there's some cities have it. Coral Gables in South Florida has entrance gates. But you didn't just walk into a city. You walked through an entrance gate. And through that entrance gate, you would get a peek of the city. And then the surfaces were covered with lime, so you could walk in a very straight and beautiful line. And then there would be both horizontal buildings, there would be hills, and then there would be tall vertical buildings. And then there would be pyramids, and on top of each pyramid would be a temple. So the pyramids didn't just go out vertically like a high rise, but they gradually ascended. So it married the buildings to the earth. So the Mayas were great at taking the silhouette of the mountains, silhouette of the hills, making their own artificial Garden of Eden. And they made artificial hills that went up and culminated in pyramids where they worshiped their god.
When we look at a Mayan pyramid, we're looking at something that was not built once, but was built and rebuilt and altered generation after generation. Unlike New York or even Fort Lauderdale, where we tear things down. If I understand it right, the Mayans did not tear down a building when they wanted a bigger structure. Is that correct?
Yeah, that's a very important thing we covered in the book. I covered it completely, but here it is basically. We have something called historic preservation. It's supposed to be something good. What we do occasionally is preserve one building. That's the lowest level of historic preservation. The second level is when we preserve a neighborhood. That's better. But the Maya did something even better. They had the footprint of their history evolving out of each generation. So one generation would build a pyramid and temples. The next generation would build on top of that, using the shapes and the forms of previous generations to shape their own. And so some pyramids had 7 or 8 superimposed structures. The historic preservation in the Maya was continuous, but it was always with respect to the past. We have a feeling today that something has to be new, something has to be fabulous. But they had the concept that their whole civilization was great, and they didn't have to recreate it, but they had to evolve it. See, it evolved in the juxtaposition of superimposed buildings. And you can see it down in the ruins today, and because of that, we can now reconstruct the way it was centuries before. In other words, this gives us a way to reconstruct history accurately through archaeology.
Now, water was very scarce in many parts of the Maya Empire. How did they handle the shortage of water?
Well, it's not only water, but the total environment. There's some miracles here. When I saw and discovered the Maya, I said, wow, they're building in the most hostile place in the world. There's dense jungle. There's flat plateaus in the Yucatan. There's hot areas, cold areas, rain, not rain. And so all these adverse ecological environments did not stop the Maya miraculously from creating great civilizations in diverse areas. Now, water is the staff of life. Water is the most important, particularly in the Yucatan. So what they would do is underneath this flat surface, the stone crust, was great reservoirs of water. And they would use the caves and the springs, and they would cenotes, which were sinkholes, as a source of water. But it dominated their existence. And they would have human sacrifice. I have a beautiful painting in the book of human sacrifice in the cenote in Chichen Itza. So you're right, water is the most important thing. And I go into, and I guess we'll discuss it, the collapse of the Maya, and indirectly the lack of water plays a part in that.
Let's talk about the collapse of the Maya now, because they sowed the seeds of their own destruction in their architecture. How did they do that?
Well, there's many theories about why they collapsed. We know they collapsed. This was a great civilization, a great bubble, let's say, that suddenly collapsed. And they went from this very advanced civilization, one of the most advanced civilizations in the world, in mathematics, in astronomy, in architecture, in design, in landscape, in all human endeavor. They were way ahead of what Western civilization was doing in Europe, with some exceptions, maybe Egypt and the Mesopotamian Valley. Now, this great civilization suddenly collapsed. It retreated into the jungle. It went from the highest civilization to the lowest. It went from learned